new figures have emerged that 140,000 children never returned to school after lockdown. Journalist and author Harriet Sergeant has spent the last year documenting some of Britain's ghost children, and the think tank, the Centre for Social Justice, has also released a new report on this issue. Harriet's written about it for the cover piece in a magazine this week, and she joins me now, along with Conservative MP Miriam Cates, who sits on the Education Select Committee. Harriet and Miriam, welcome to Spectator TV. Thank you so much for your time today. Now, Harriet, you've written in the magazine about the plight of Britain's ghost children. 140,000 of them in the country. What's happened to these children?
Well, this is quite extraordinary because in 2019, there were 60,000 children who were out of school more than they spent time in school. Now we're, how many years are we from finishing lockdown? And yet the numbers are going up. I mean, last year when I first looked at it, it was 100,000. So this is a quite extraordinary increase. And from all this excellent report from the Centre for Social Justice saying that the figures are going to keep going up because this is a problem that has not been recognised by government and which government are doing nothing about.
That's incredible. And it falls on the Centre for Social Justice and journalists like yourself to bring into light this information. I mean, it is quite shocking, actually. Why do you think the numbers are going up since the end of lockdown?
I think that nobody has realised quite the long-term damage that has been done to these kids. I mean, I interviewed an awful lot of them, and they seem to fall in two parts. There seem to be those that, and generally these are girls, but not necessarily, that just can't go out of their room. They're just crippled by anxiety. They are really distressed. They essentially won't go out of their room. If they do go to school, they manage like one morning and then they go home. And then there are the other extreme, mainly boys, but not always, who won't go back home, who are out on the streets, who are into all kinds of things that they really shouldn't be into, and are angry and are bitter and feel that they've simply, I mean, I interviewed one in Streatham High Street who said, he was hoping to get his results to go to college, and he never got them, and his dreams are broken. And there's young people like this, young apprentices all over the country whose dreams have been broken and can't get those years back.
And Miriam, as an MP and the mother of three, you were one of the few politicians to speak out against school closures during the lockdown. I mean, is this the kind of scenario that you thought might have happened?
Well, of course, these are difficult decisions, and I wouldn't have wanted to be in any of their shoes. And, the former Prime Minister has obviously been grilled this week. But I think we have a blind spot in this country over children's welfare. And that wasn't just around the pandemic and lockdowns. We can see that in many areas of our life and politics. But I think children always should be the first priority. They are our future. And we talk a lot about vulnerable groups, and rightly so, but the only truly vulnerable group in society that we ought to be protecting at all times is children. And we completely lost sight of them. And of course, it's good to protect elderly people. Of course, it's good to protect people with health challenges. But actually, our top priority, our number one priority, should have been children, given what we did know about the disease at that point, which was that it was very, very harmless to children. So I think it's just indicative of a wider blind spot that we have in our politics, which is not putting children first. And I think it was worse than that. We actually used children as a buffer against the disease and to make older people feel safer, which, again, you can understand politically, but I think was the wrong choice. Yeah,
well, just on that, Harriet, when it comes to this disparity, this adults not understanding children, what I was struck by in your piece was how often kids knew what was going on. Kids knew that their friends hadn't come back to school, but they had to go tell the teachers, who then had to contact parents. So it seemed like the adults just didn't have a grip on what was going on, whether that's teachers, parents, or politicians indeed. But the kids knew what was going on.
Well, I mean, this very sad story that you mentioned about one girl told me that a boy had dropped out of school, and she suddenly saw him sitting by the side of the road looking homeless, just on a bit of cardboard, very dirty, very shabby. And she said he'd always been popular at school, so all the other kids were buying him food, bringing him clothes. And finally, someone told the teacher. So they got the boy back into school, but he was so far behind, and this is something that seems to have affected a lot of kids, where they get back into school, they're so far behind, and he got very angry and he left and hasn't really been seen again.
How much of it do you think is a poverty issue, as a class issue? So like parents who are, time poor, resource poor, just don't have the time to get their kids back into school?
Well, I mean, that was very interesting because there was definitely the kids, the most vulnerable kids in disadvantaged areas on free school meals. They all have double the rates of sort of dropping out to their contemporaries. And certainly there are children who, I know because I befriended 4 boys from a South London gang about 15 years ago, and they are at the age of 15 had dropped out. They've always been kids that had dropped out, and they were, drug dealing and mugging rather than going to school. But look what's happened to them. They, in the last 15 years, have been in and out of prison.
Sets you on a path, doesn't it?
Yes, and at great cost to themselves and to us taxpayers.
Yeah.
And how are we going to cope with now, not 60,000 children, but 140,000 and rising? How are we going to cope with these numbers of children if they start going through the criminal justice system? There doesn't seem to be one government institution who speaks for them. There's the Children's Commissioner, and they're very eloquent, but they don't have the power.
Yeah, of
Who's
course.
going to take responsibility for them?
Well, Miriam, let me ask you this question as the politician in this conversation. Where were the adults during the pandemic? Ofsted, the Department of Education, the Children's Commissioner, who I know has been looking at this, but clearly not enough has been done.
Well, I think the Children's Commissioner is excellent and she does a great job of shedding light on some of these issues. But I think, as Harriet says in her article, she doesn't have any power. And I think the recommendations that the CSJ have made in their report are excellent about much more bespoke relationships to try and get children back into school rather than a one-size-fits-all fining approach or something like that. So I think there's some good recommendations. But it's a good question. Whose responsibility is it? And I think, again, one of the problems that potentially existed before lockdown but was made very visible during lockdown is that as a society we've kind of privatized family life, and we think that all you need is the nuclear family and all you need is the household, and that if you just have to retreat into your household for 2 years, well, that's fine. But of course it's not fine. We exist, we are social beings, we need each other, not just for resources and economic purposes, but also for company, for learning, all these things that we interdepend on each other for. And you cannot just reduce that to household units. It doesn't work. And again, who is going to take responsibility for that? I don't know. Of course, part of it is the government's responsibility, but it's a whole society responsibility. And let's not forget, it wasn't only the government that was shutting schools down. Teaching unions were calling for it. Some parents were calling for it. The media was certainly calling for it. It actually would have been very difficult for the government not to do it from a political point of view. So we all share that responsibility as a society. We were all obsessed with the death figures and the hospital figures and wearing masks and how the virus travelled. This was a national obsession and, maybe understandably, but very few people in any walk of life were speaking up for the impact on children. And I think, we're reaping that now, not just in educational loss, but in whole culture shifts about whether education is optional or not, the value that people place on education. It's going to take a long time to row back.
So, Miriam, what do you think needs to be done now? Harriet writes very well in her piece about how visitations for early years is still not back. Some of these things are still not back to normal, as we've heard about. These ghost children are actually increasing in number, not decreasing. So what is to be done now that we're out of the pandemic, and what is the government doing about it?
Well, again, in the report, one of the recommendations is for an increased number of attendance officers. That sounds a bit formal, but people to go around building relationships with families that are struggling and coaching them back into school, into early years, into society. And I do think that's the right approach. I don't think fining everybody or, changing a guidance across the board or anything like that is going to help. We need a bespoke approach. So I think that is a good idea. But I also think we need a mea culpa, really. We need some adults somewhere to stand up and say, kids, we got this wrong. This was not in your best interests. Education shouldn't be optional. You can't thrive at home on your own. You need to be back at school. Now, that might seem a bit tokenistic, but I think when adults get things wrong, and we know this as parents, it's important to own that. Otherwise, how do the children know that a mistake was made and actually you're taking a new approach? So I do think we need that. The government kind of got into that space a year ago. Nadeem Zahawi said it was a mistake to close schools, which I think was a very brave thing to do. But we need something much bigger than that to encourage children to come back. But, these issues are very complex. There's not just one group of children that's struggling. Yes, deprivation. Yes, special educational needs. Girls with anxiety. Boys who think that the education system has failed them anyway and now have seen all their extracurricular activities cancelled to try and give them more maths lessons. There's a lot of questions we can ask about the education system. But I do think as adults, we need to signal that we got it wrong.
Harriet?
Yes, I mean, a lot of the children I interviewed were very angry with their schools. And that's part of the problem because their schools did nothing.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I found so extraordinary was the variability. Some schools went out of their way to reach their children, see their children, even feed their children, I mean, as well as teach them. And others did absolutely nothing. I mean, I had one boy who was meant to be at an outstanding school in a sort of leafy suburb, very competitive, and he gave up and started to despair because nobody was marking his work. He was doing all his work and then no single teacher could be bothered to mark his work. And he got very bitter.
Of course.
And this is true of many of the kids that I interviewed. So they're not going back into those schools because when it was important, those teachers didn't care for them. So why should they go back and give them a second chance?
Yes, of course. I mean, do you think, Harriet, that Ofsted needs to be overhauled somewhat or just looked at? I mean, if this outstanding school had teachers like that.
What was the Department of Education doing? I'm sorry. Why was the Department of Education saying, hello, why are some schools, busting a gut to teach children and other schools doing nothing? They were doing nothing. I find it quite extraordinary. And also within schools, I mean, one girl said she had a great history teacher who was never stopped contacting her, but her English teacher she never heard of. Well, why was that being allowed to happen?
Yeah.
It seems quite extraordinary.
Absolutely. Miriam, do you think that looking ahead, if there were to be, God forbid, another pandemic or whatever it is, we would think a bit more long-term about this when it comes to kids?
Well, I hope so. And the evidence is obviously compelling and compounding in terms of the impact on children. Of course, it would depend on the nature of the pandemic. I mean, I wouldn't be saying all this if we were talking about a disease which had a 50% mortality rate for children. We have to get this in proportion. The reason it was the wrong policy was because this disease was so harmless to children. And actually, although, unfortunately, lots of people did die of or with COVID, the vast majority of those that died were elderly and that, around the age of life expectancy in this country, which is of course sad, but is not the same as lots and lots of young people dying from this virus. So it would depend on the pandemic. But I think we've got so much evidence now that, yes, I hope it would be different. But the COVID inquiry, when the terms of reference were first published, didn't even mention children and schooling. And that is a worry. We need to make sure that the impact on children is front and centre of the inquiry so that we don't forget it and we make sure we use that information in future.
Really great to hear from you, Miriam Cates. Thank you so much for joining Spectator TV, and Harriet Sergeant too.